An old black man, dressed in tattered clothes, walked into a large bank in the heart of the city. He slowly declared, "This bank is mine." Immediately, mocking laughter echoed throughout the lobby. A security guard approached, intending to escort him out. But as the old man slowly opened the worn-out canvas bag on his shoulder, all laughter ceased, replaced by stunned silence. The bank doors suddenly swung open, attracting all the curious and mocking glances from inside. Another elderly black man stepped in. His hair was a tangled mess of silver curls, his face etched with the harsh marks of time and hardship. He wore a thick, dark brown coat, patched up in several places, covered in dirt as though it had seen countless years of wandering. His shoes were worn out, the soles frayed, and every step he took seemed slow and laborious. On his shoulder was a rough, frayed canvas bag, faded by time, looking heavy. Seeing him, people inside the bank immediately began whispering to each other, their whispers mixed with soft, mocking laughter. A middle-aged white woman dressed in expensive clothes quickly pulled her purse closer, casting a glance that was both nervous and wary. A young bank employee standing by the counter smirked and whispered to a colleague, "That old man must have wandered in here by mistake. What a hassle." His colleague scoffed, nodding in agreement, throwing a disdainful look at the old man. The old man who had just entered continued to walk calmly forward, his deep black eyes still serene and resolute, seemingly unconcerned by the disdainful gazes around him. He slowly made his way to the center of the lobby, stopping in the heavy silence, filled with curiosity and derision from the surrounding customers. A tall security guard, dressed in a neat uniform, took a few steps forward, his brow furrowed as he assessed the old man with an obviously unfriendly attitude. This was Stephen, a burly white man known for his aggressive and impatient demeanor. He shook his head slightly, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, eyes full of disdain. The atmosphere seemed to freeze in a mix of curiosity and tension as the old man slowly stood up straight in the bustling bank lobby, slowly raising his eyes to scan the faces directed toward him. Then, in a quiet but clear voice, he broke the suffocating silence in the bank, "This bank is mine." His soft yet determined words caused the entire lobby to fall into a stunned silence before a chorus of mocking laughter erupted, echoing mockingly throughout every corner. It seemed that Elijah, the old black man who had just entered, had anticipated this reaction. He stood there, unwavering, his gaze firm and strong, an enigmatic figure in the heart of a large bank. Elijah stood in the center of the lobby and spoke clearly, "This bank is mine." Immediately, the vast space inside the bank erupted with mocking laughter. At first, it was faint, but it quickly spread like a wave of disdain that engulfed the poor old man. The crowd's laughter wasn't just from surprise but also from a deep sense of contempt, as though Elijah's skin color and ragged appearance had turned him into a cheap joke in their eyes. In the corner of the room, two young tellers, Sarah and Michael, leaned toward each other, whispering maliciously, "That old man must be drunk. These folks from the projects always dream these crazy fantasies." Michael sneered, "Maybe he thinks this is the welfare office." Sarah responded with a condescending laugh. Their words weren't whispered softly enough to avoid Elijah's ears, but he remained still, his gaze unwavering, looking directly at the main counter, where Mr. Thompson, the acting bank manager, stood. Mr. Thompson was a man in his late 40s, with neatly combed blonde hair, a typical face of a well-educated white man from the suburbs, with cold light blue eyes always showing a hint of cautiousness and a touch of arrogance. Noticing the situation was drawing unnecessary attention, Mr. Thompson quickly signaled for Stephen, the security guard, to step forward. Stephen approached Elijah with an unmistakable sneer on his face. He gestured toward the front door and spoke in a patronizing tone, "Hey old man, this isn't a place for you to wander in and cause trouble. You'd better leave before I have to get physical." Stephen said firmly, each word carrying a threatening tone, his hand resting on his gun holster. Elijah slowly turned to look at Stephen, his gaze unflinching. There was no sign of fear on his weathered face, only an odd sense of calmness that made Stephen hesitate for a few seconds. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Elijah said slowly, his voice still clear and steady enough to echo throughout the space. "I'm here to take back what's mine, something this bank took from me over half a century ago." His strong and unwavering words once again silenced the entire lobby. Mr. Thompson, who had initially dismissed this as a small disturbance, now felt an unusual sense of unease. He stepped out from behind the counter and approached Elijah, his demeanor polite but cold, his eyes filled with doubt and impatience. "Sir, I'm not sure what you think, but you're mistaken. This bank has been here for decades, owned by the Harrison family since my grandfather's time." "Perhaps you're confusing something," Mr. Thompson said clearly, trying to maintain a professional calm but failing to hide a fleeting look of contempt in his eyes. "I'm not mistaken," Elijah replied firmly, slowly placing his old canvas bag down on the floor, as if it contained a secret that was about to turn everything upside down. "I will show you right here, right now." A few customers started to step back, exchanging glances filled with confusion and curiosity. The white customers, accustomed to the stable, wealthy life of the area, seemed inconvenienced by an old, poor black man disrupting their peaceful afternoon. Meanwhile, Stephen, growing increasingly impatient, stepped closer to Elijah and said sharply, "I'm warning you one last time, old man. Either you leave, or I'll call the police. Don't make this worse." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He simply bent down slowly and began to open the old canvas bag. His trembling hands were steady, each movement deliberate. Everyone held their breath, watching the old man's strange actions. Even Stephen paused for a beat, his hand on his gun holster slightly loosening, a mix of suspicion and curiosity written on his tense face. "Everything I need to say is in here," Elijah said softly but confidently, then slowly opened the bag, revealing what it had been concealing. The moment the bag opened, the entire lobby of the bank fell into absolute silence as those who witnessed the moment widened their eyes in shock. What Elijah had just revealed wasn't merely the nonsensical ramblings of an old poor man, it was a truth so explosive it could potentially upend everything they thought they knew about this place. The moment the bag was opened, before anyone could see what was inside, Stephen, the tall white security guard with a scowl, stepped forward with a distinctly aggressive demeanor. Without hesitation, he stamped his heel loudly on the marble floor, the sound intentionally breaking the silence that had spread throughout the lobby. "That's enough." Stephen barked, his words coming out like an order full of contempt. "This is a bank, not a shelter for wandering black people causing trouble." His words echoed throughout the space, causing some of the white customers around him to nod in silent agreement, their eyes clearly reflecting deep-seated prejudices passed down through generations. The bank employees, who had been curious before, now subtly took a step back, their faces showing clear discomfort. Some even whispered to each other, seemingly in tacit agreement with the harsh insult just thrown. However, Elijah remained standing there, unmoving in the face of the insults and discriminatory stares aimed at him. His weathered face remained calm, his deep black eyes unwavering, even gleaming with an unusual resolve. He slowly raised his head and looked directly at Stephen, his gaze piercing enough to make Stephen feel a brief twinge of unease. "I'm not causing trouble," Elijah responded, his voice still calm, clear, and steady as cold steel. "I've come to reclaim what rightfully belongs to me. What you call me doesn't matter, the truth doesn't change because of insults." Stephen was slightly taken aback by the steadfastness and calmness of the frail old man standing before him. He was used to using harsh words and aggressive gestures to easily make people like Elijah back down, humiliated and escorted out. But this time, Stephen clearly faced something he hadn't anticipated, the silent, unyielding strength of an old black man who seemed harmless. A small cough broke the tense air. Mr. Thompson, the bank manager who had been silently observing from the beginning, finally spoke, his tone polite, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Stephen, please calm down," Mr. Thompson said, still looking at Elijah with a cold gaze but no longer showing the clear contempt that the security guard had. "Sir, if you truly have any evidence, we will review it, but first, I request that you stop causing a disturbance in my bank." Elijah gave a slight nod, then slowly bent down, his old hands carefully pulling out a worn, yellowed ledger from the bag. He slowly raised it up, letting everyone see it clearly, and his voice rang out steadily but with weight. "This is the ledger of First National Bank from 1948, the time when I founded this institution. I am Elijah K. Johnson, and I am the rightful owner of this bank before it was stolen by greed and racial hatred." His declaration caused the lobby to fall into another heavy silence as astonished and confused glances were exchanged. Some customers, though still trying to maintain their disdainful expressions, now harbored a growing sense of curiosity and unease. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson suddenly turned pale, his hand trembling slightly as he heard the name Johnson echo clearly throughout the expansive space of the bank. As for Stephen, despite maintaining a tough and aggressive expression on the outside, a flicker of doubt appeared deep in his eyes. He took half a step back, his hand that had previously been resting menacingly on his gun belt now subconsciously lowering. It seemed Stephen had just realized that the frail old black man standing before him was not simply a troublesome wanderer as he had insulted him earlier. Elijah stood silently, holding the old ledger aloft, his gaze never leaving the now changing face of Mr. Thompson. In that moment, he knew that he had made those who had scorned and belittled him begin to reconsider, and more importantly, the truth he brought was slowly shaking the very foundation of the world they had always believed to be stable and inviolable. In an instant, the atmosphere in the bank shifted from one filled with contemptuous glances and mockery to one of tension and unease as a truth was about to be revealed, a truth that had the potential to change everything. Amid the suffocating tension, Elijah stood still, lifting the old, tattered book as if it were a flag of truth that he had traded his whole life for. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly lowered the book, his aged eyes soaked with distant memories yet sharp, scanning the faces that were watching him with tension. No one spoke, no one dared move, and even the breath seemed to freeze in that moment. Elijah, with a calm expression and deliberate movements, bent down and quietly placed the worn canvas bag on the marble floor. The sound it made in the absolute silence startled everyone in the bank's lobby, causing them all to freeze, holding their breath. That bag, which just moments ago had been dismissed as the cheap belongings of an old drifter, now became the focal point of every gaze, as if it held an earth-shattering truth waiting to be revealed. Stephen, who had just moments ago looked at Elijah with the most contemptuous gaze, now lost the confidence he had earlier. He took a small step back, his legs moving involuntarily, as if his instincts were telling him that he had just come into contact with something uncontrollable. In that instant, the usual aggression and disdain that Stephen carried were replaced by a deep sense of doubt and caution. Mr. Thompson stood frozen, his face as rigid as stone, his eyes fixed on the bag as if he were hypnotized. Mr. Thompson, a man known for his ability to control any situation, was famous in the banking world for handling difficult cases with a calm and professional demeanor, but this time it was clear that Mr. Thompson was being cornered into a situation he had never faced before. His hand unconsciously clenched, trembling slightly, as though he were afraid of what lay inside that old, tattered bag. Elijah seemed in no rush. He let the silence and tension build to its peak, slowly bending down to untie the bag's string. His gnarled, wrinkled hands, worn by years of hardship, moved with a steadiness and determination that no one could deny. As soon as the last knot was undone, Elijah slowly opened the mouth of the bag, letting its contents slowly emerge into the light of the bank's lobby. Everyone present leaned in subconsciously, curious to see what awaited them. And then, stacks of old, faded money slowly became visible, one bundle at a time, rolling gently out onto the cold marble floor, scattered in disarray. Each bundle clearly bore the old logo of First National Bank, a symbol that had not been used for over half a century. The bills were yellowed, the edges worn, as though they had just been pulled from a long-forgotten storage vault, something even the most senior bank employees had never seen before. An invisible chill seemed to run down the spines of everyone in the lobby. Stephen's eyes widened in shock, trying to mask the confusion that was clearly rising on his face. He cast a doubtful look at Mr. Thompson, as if silently begging for an explanation, but Mr. Thompson, too, looked just as startled, his face visibly pale as he stared at the ancient bundles of money. "It can't be," Mr. Thompson whispered, his voice trembling, losing the calmness he usually exuded. How do you have this money?" Elijah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he carefully picked up one of the bundles, his aged, slender hand gently caressing the faded paper as though holding a precious but painful piece of memory. His eyes briefly flashed with emotion, as if for a moment he was traveling back in time to the earliest days when he founded First National Bank, when he laid each brick to build it, filled with dreams and hope. In 1948, he spoke slowly, his voice quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I founded this bank with my own hands and sweat. Every dollar, every brick beneath your feet carries my mark. But then, just because I'm black, you believed the lies and drove me out of here." Elijah's words rang out clear and strong, filled with emotion and conviction. In the lobby, the curious gazes began to shift from awe to unease and confusion. Many began to feel ashamed as they realized the harsh truth that the old man had just revealed, though some stubbornly refused to believe his story. Stephen tried to regain his composure and stepped forward a little, his voice more cautious now but still full of doubt. "How do we know this isn't some kind of scam, old man? Someone like you, where could you get this?" Elijah looked straight into Stephen's eyes, his gaze so sharp it made the young security guard freeze, feeling an unexplainable sense of authority and resolve. "Because I am Elijah K. Johnson," the old man said, "the man this very bank stole his identity, his assets, and his life from." He paused for a moment, looking around the vast room, then continued, "And now I'm here to take it all back." His words echoed through the lobby, leaving everyone stunned as they began to realize that they were witnessing the beginning of a storm that would change everything they ever knew about First National Bank, a truth that could no longer be buried. As Elijah's voice faded, the vast space inside First National Bank seemed to thicken, each echo of his declaration still hanging in the air, heavy with tension. Ancient stacks of money lay scattered across the cold stone floor, each yellowed bill a haunting reminder of a forgotten past that this bank had buried over half a century ago. All eyes were fixed on the old man, a mix of astonishment and skepticism in their gaze. The bank manager, Mr. Thompson, had gone pale. Though he was always confident in his ability to handle any situation, this was clearly something beyond his imagination. Confronted with these old yet undeniable pieces of evidence, he felt the once solid foundation of power beneath him beginning to shake. Mr. Thompson quickly stepped forward, bent down, and picked up a bundle of old, faded bills. He stared at the worn logo imprinted on the crinkled paper, then turned to Elijah with an expression of both surprise and irritation. "You say you are Elijah K. Johnson, the original founder of First National Bank in 1948? Mr. Thompson tried to maintain a calm tone, but the tremor in his voice revealed his unease. "Yes," Elijah replied briefly but firmly, his gaze old yet sharp, cutting through every doubt. "I am the one who laid the first stones to build this bank. I spent my youth and heart to make First National Bank a symbol from which you all benefit today. But it was all stolen from me simply because I am black." Mr. Thompson shook his head repeatedly, trying to deny what he had just heard. He knew that if what this old man said was true, then the entire history of First National Bank, which he had always been so proud of, would be completely upended. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, and the composure he was so accustomed to was rapidly slipping away. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, trying to regain control of the situation, and looked at Elijah with an expression of both doubt and challenge. "What you're saying is hard to believe, Mr. Johnson. If you were the founder of this bank, why is there no record of you in the history of First National Bank? I've studied every document of this bank, and I've never seen a name like that mentioned." Mr. Thompson's voice grew more forceful, as if clinging to the slim hope that this was all just a misunderstanding or some kind of scam. Elijah did not respond immediately. Instead, he calmly reached into his bag once again and pulled out an old, worn leather ledger with a dark brown cover, faintly imprinted with the words First National Bank Ledger 1948. He gently flipped through the yellowed and torn pages, then stopped at a particular page where a series of signatures and handwritten notes in faded ink were recorded. "This is the first ledger of First National Bank," Elijah spoke slowly, his voice deep but commanding, capturing the absolute attention of everyone present. "It has my name, Elijah K. Johnson, alongside my business partner at the time, Walter Davis. We founded this bank together, but then greed and racism made Walter Davis turn his back on me." His voice faltered slightly, his eyes filled with the deep pain of a man who had been betrayed by someone he once trusted. He continued in a steady but emotional tone, Davis couldn't accept that a black man like me could own and lead a large bank like First National, so he secretly conspired with other powerful people, forged documents, and spread lies that I was incapable of running the bank. They forced me out of the very project I had built, erased my name, and closed every door when I sought justice. Each of Elijah's words seemed like a sharp knife cutting through the veil of hidden history, causing those present in the bank to shiver. Some customers lowered their heads, feeling ashamed as they realized the injustice the old man had endured, while others remained skeptical, whispering to one another about the truth of his story. Stephen, who had always maintained an aggressive attitude, now couldn't deny the seriousness in the old man's words. His gaze had lost its initial confidence, replaced by confusion and doubt. He quietly looked to Mr. Thompson, waiting for orders or direction from his superior. Mr. Thompson, still gripping the old ledger tightly, nervously flipped through the pages, his anxiety growing with each turn. His heart raced as he clearly saw Elijah K. Johnson's signature on the first few lines about the bank's history. The words that seemed to have been dormant in the past now awakened with force, placing Mr. Thompson in a situation he could no longer deny. "No, it can't be," Mr. Thompson mumbled, his voice trembling with despair as he tried to deny what he was seeing. But the more he tried to deny it, the clearer it became that each old page was undeniable evidence of a deep, systemic injustice that had taken place more than 70 years ago. In the midst of the crushing tension, Elijah stood tall, his eyes bright and unwavering, as if he had never been defeated. He knew he had accomplished the impossible, the truth was starting to speak, and this time no one could stop it. For him, this was just the first step in a long journey to reclaim the justice that had been lost so long ago. As Mr. Thompson stood there, his trembling hand flipping through the yellowed pages, his eyes fixed on the signature and familiar handwriting of a past that seemed to have completely disappeared from this world, Elijah let out a quiet sigh, his gaze shifting toward the large window of First National Bank as if old memories suddenly rushed back, vivid and sharp, painfully clear. He quietly placed the ledger on the table, his bony fingers still trembling, not from fear but from the emotion of remembering those bitter, distant days. The vast bankroom sank into deep silence, all eyes fixed on the old man, as if waiting for the next part of the story, a truth that had been buried beneath the weight of greed and social prejudice for over half a century. Elijah slowly lifted his head, his eyes still full of life but also hiding the pain, disappointment, and wounds that had never healed. He spoke, his voice gentle but resonant, carrying the deep sorrow of a life once betrayed. In 1948, Walter Davis and I started building this bank from nothing. Back then, society still had many barriers for black people like me, but that didn't discourage me. I poured my heart, my youth, and my dreams into every brick, every stone that made up this bank, hoping First National Bank would become a symbol of fairness and prosperity. His voice slightly cracked, as if each memory tightened his throat, but Elijah continued his story with the resolve of someone who had lived through and witnessed each event. Walter Davis was my closest partner at first. I trusted him unconditionally. I never imagined that greed and social prejudice could change a person so quickly. But what I couldn't foresee was that the very friend who had stood by my side would become the one to conspire to take everything from me. The people in the bank started to murmur among themselves, their faces a mix of confusion and sympathy. Even Stephen, who was usually aggressive, fell into an unusual silence, as if reflecting on Elijah's words, strong and sincere words that no one could ignore. Elijah paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the faces that were intently watching him, then continued speaking slowly, as if each word needed to be remembered deeply. "One day, I will never forget, Walter secretly colluded with a group of powerful white shareholders, convincing them that a black man couldn't run a bank effectively. He used the most despicable reasons, leveraging my skin color to build a lie, claiming that I wasn't competent and that my presence would harm the bank's reputation. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm before continuing. They quickly united and ousted me from the board using shady legal tactics. I tried to seek justice. I took all the evidence to court, pleading from one courtroom to the next, from one lawyer to another. But at that time, people like me, people of color, never had a voice in that biased society." By now, Elijah's voice quivered, his eyes filled with unshed tears that didn't fall. It seemed as though he was reliving the most painful days of his life, when every door to justice slammed shut before him simply because of his skin color, even though he held all the undeniable evidence of the truth. I went everywhere, from local governments to higher courts, presenting the irrefutable evidence again and again, but all I received in return was indifference, coldness, or even contempt. One judge even coldly looked at me and said, "You should know your place. How could a black man ever run a bank?" The customers standing in the bank became still with emotion and confusion. A few lowered their heads in shame, realizing that the history they were witnessing was indeed cruel beyond belief. Mr. Thompson seemed frozen in place, his face now completely losing the arrogance it once held. It was as if he was finally seeing the grave injustice of the past that he had unknowingly inherited. Elijah took another deep breath, trying to keep his composure, his eyes brimming with emotion, but his voice grew sharper, stronger than ever as he continued, "In the end, I was left with nothing. Not only did I lose the bank I had dedicated my life to building, but I also lost my dignity and career. They wiped my name from every record, erasing me from existence as if I had never been here." He paused again, his deep gaze fixed on Mr. Thompson and Stephen as if trying to pierce their souls. "And now I've returned, not for revenge, but to force you to face the truth. You must understand that every brick, every dollar, every breath of this bank came from my sacrifice and loss." Elijah's words reverberated powerfully in the thick silence. Everyone understood that the truth he had just revealed was not just the story of one man but the deep pain, the stain in history that they had purposely chosen to forget. In that moment, Elijah stood there, resilient and unbowed, not just as an old man in poverty but as the living symbol of the fight against injustice, prejudice, and greed that history had once buried. But now he had returned, and this time he would not allow anyone to erase him again. The atmosphere inside First National Bank remained heavy with silence after Elijah finished recounting his painful story. The eyes of the crowd silently followed every small movement of the old man, with expressions of shock and a sense of shame as they realized they were witnessing a long-hidden, brutal past. It felt as though the air itself had become stagnant, waiting for something greater to emerge. In that tense moment, Elijah slowly bent down to his old canvas bag once again, his movements deliberate and steady, as if he wanted everyone in the room to fully witness the truth he was about to reveal. His eyes were calm yet resolute, carrying the confidence of a man who had waited over half a century to prove his innocence. From the bag, Elijah pulled out a stack of yellowed papers, carefully wrapped in oilskin, preserved like a precious artifact for decades. He stood up straight and carefully opened the oilskin, his aged fingers gently turning each page. All eyes in the room were immediately focused on him, with a mix of curiosity and tension, waiting to see what this old man would reveal that might leave them in shock. "These are the original legal documents, never before disclosed," Elijah said, his voice clear yet calm. "These papers prove that I never signed any document transferring ownership of this bank to anyone, especially not to the Harrison family." The name Harrison immediately caused the room to tense up to the point that a few people standing nearby could be heard breathing heavily. Harrison was not a name unfamiliar to First National Bank, as the Harrison family was one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the state. They had run the bank for generations, and no one had ever questioned the legitimacy of their ownership. Mr. Thompson, the bank manager standing closest to Elijah, began to feel everything around him spin, his legs nearly buckled, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Mr. Thompson tried to maintain his composure, but his efforts only made his unease more apparent. He stammered, his voice trembling, What are you saying, Mr. Johnson? The Harrison family has always been the legitimate owner of First National Bank. That's been recognized for generations." Elijah fixed his sharp gaze on Mr. Thompson, as if piercing through every flimsy excuse the man could offer. He stepped closer to Mr. Thompson, gently placing the stack of documents into the shaking hands of the stunned bank manager. "Mr. Thompson, look at these documents for yourself. You'll understand better than anyone what I've just said. You've been living in the lie created by your predecessors." Mr. Thompson reluctantly took the papers, trying to hold them steady so they wouldn't fall to the floor. He began reading line by line, every signature and seal faded by time but still clear enough to reveal a shocking truth. His heart raced, his face turning pale as each line he read shattered his trust in the Harrison family's history, a history he had once been so proud of. Beside Mr. Thompson, Stephen, too, could no longer maintain his usual aggressive demeanor. He quietly observed the expression on his superior's face, a deep unease rising within him. Until now, Stephen had always believed he stood on the side of justice, on the side of societal order, but now that belief was being severely shaken. Finally, Mr. Thompson stopped at a page bearing the signatures of Elijah K. Johnson and Walter Davis. He studied it more closely, feeling a jolt of cold run down his spine as he realized that there were no signatures from Elijah on any of the later property transfer documents. All the documents were signed and legitimized by Walter Davis and the Harrison family quietly and insidiously. "No, it can't be," Mr. Thompson muttered, his voice barely audible for his ears alone. He looked up at Elijah, his face filled with disbelief and despair. "If these papers are real, then—" Elijah cut him off firmly, but his voice remained steady. "Then it means that First National Bank was unlawfully seized by the Harrison family and Walter Davis, exploiting social prejudice to remove me. This is not just a story of greed, but a historical case, the clearest evidence of the injustice I've suffered throughout my life." The people in the bank were stunned by his declaration. Some had begun pulling out their phones to record the rare scene, while others stood frozen like statues, unable to believe what they were witnessing. A truth too big, too unexpected, was appending everything they thought they knew about the bank they had trusted all these years. Amid the chaos, Elijah remained steady, his gaze now carrying the determination and strength of a man who had endured too much pain but never lost faith in justice. He knew that though it was late, the truth had finally come to light, and no one could deny it anymore. Mr. Thompson, still holding the legal papers that provided irrefutable evidence, slowly sank into a chair, his face numb like someone just awakening from a long, deep sleep, forced to confront the greatest shock of his life. His world, and perhaps the history of First National Bank, would never be the same again. As Mr. Thompson slowly sat down in his chair, his hands still trembling as they gripped the yellowed papers as if they were the last remnants of a world he had just lost, the entire First National Bank lobby fell into a silent chaos. The whispers began to rise among the customers standing around like an undercurrent, swiftly spreading across the ocean, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and doubt. None of them had ever imagined that today, when they stepped into this familiar bank, they would witness a shocking truth that would shake and upend all their trust.